Hi, I'm Dr. John Neufeld. Welcome to Back to the Bible Canada. I've been doing a series, and it's a number of weeks now. We've been talking about God's providence, which is His meticulous sovereignty over everything that occurs. God controls all things. I have decided that since this is the last time that I'm going to be speaking on that, I'm going to take on a test case and talk about one area in our lives in which we can apply the doctrine of sovereignty and the doctrine of God's providence to our individual lives. So hang with me. We're going to do that, and I'm going to talk specifically about this matter of fear. Let me begin by taking us to 1 Samuel chapter 15. And this is a moment in Israel's history that's pivotal. Saul, King Saul, he is the son of Kish. He's a man from the tribe of Benjamin who once thought little of himself. He becomes king, and one of the tasks he's given to do is he's supposed to wage war and completely defeat the Amalekites. The Amalekites were a threat to the national life of Israel, and so something needed to be done, and this was a test of his kingship and whether or not he could command troops in battle and call individuals to follow him. So, a lot is at stake in this, and amazingly, Saul carries it out. It's a successful war against the Amalekites. He's overwhelmingly successful. It's a military victory. And then he has also been told that when it comes to the spoils of war, that in this case, this was to be devoted entirely to the Lord. No one is to take any spoils of the war. Everything was to be utterly devoted to destruction. And so that includes the king. King Agag is to die. All the best of the livestock are to be offered as an offering unto the Lord. Instead of doing that, Saul decides that he's going to destroy anything that has of no value whatsoever. But everything that is of some value he's going to keep and allow the men to have. And eventually, the prophet Samuel shows up, and he roundly denounces the king's blatant act of rebellion. In fact, he even goes so far as to say, look, King Saul, God is going to remove the kingship from you because you will not obey the commands of God. And it is necessary for the king of Israel to be obedient to God's command. So that's a pivotal moment in his life. He doesn't obey fully. That's where we get that famous comment that to obey is better than sacrifice. So at any rate, all of that to be said, at some point in time, King Saul tells us why he disobeyed. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 24, it says, Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words because, now here he tells us why, I feared the people and I obeyed their voice. I was afraid. If I decided to do what God wanted me to do, I didn't know whether or not there might be chaos, whether or not people would rebel against my kingship, whether or not, they might even kill me. And I would be, whatever happens, even if I wasn't killed, I'd be removed. So in fear of the people, and because I wanted to please them, I displeased God. So, here's this pivotal moment, and we find out that what changed the course of Saul's trajectory in life was this moment of fear where he's blinded and he refuses to do what God wants him to do because he's terrified of what people might do. Now, fear is something that often motivates individuals. People are often afraid for all sorts of reasons. It's a remarkable thing, fear. It leads many people to disobedience of God and faithlessness as well. Let me give you another example of fear, and then I'm going to bring this matter home. I'm now taking us back to the book of Numbers, chapter 13 and 14, and it's an early time in Israel's history. So what's happened? Well, Israel has received this wonderful gift from God. God has rained down 10 plagues on Egypt. God has opened the floodgates and has allowed Israel to leave the land of slavery, and they're on the way to the promised land. But on the way to the promised land, they're to stop at Mount Sinai, and for 2 years they're going to be there, and they're going to learn what it is to worship the one true God. Now, once having done that, now they've seen God rain plagues on Egypt. They've seen God speak at Mount Sinai. The whole nation has heard the voice of God. They've received the Ten Commandments. They've received a house of worship. They've received instructions. Everything is now in place. Now is the time. Leave Mount Sinai. Go to the promised land. So that's what's happening. It's this marvelous, euphoric time. So they come to a place called Kadesh Barnea, which is right on the edge of the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they send out 12 spies to spy out the land because they need to make proper, preparations for the invasion of the land that God has given them. So the 12 spies come back, and here's what's recorded in Numbers 13:27-28. 10 of the spies say, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey." It's everything that God said it was. It's a fantastic land. And we also saw its fruit, they said. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and they're very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. So who are the descendants of Anak? Well, it's a curious thing because later on in verse 33, the matter's explained. And it says, "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, so we seemed to them." Now, maybe that doesn't, ring any bells for you, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Nephilim. So who are the Nephilim, and what caused such fear among these tribes that they went back and they just got everybody else excited about this, and everybody was just terrified? Man, oh man, the Nephilim, the sons of Anak who live in that land, they are the descendants of the Nephilim. We're in a lot of trouble. So let me define that for you. It seems that at the time of Moses, there was a memory of the Nephilim. So the Nephilim were a people group that existed before the universal flood. And so let me tell you a little bit about that. They're mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. Before the flood, violence was upon the earth. And one of the reasons why God sent a flood is because the violence was so great that people were looking to completely destroy all the people of God. The Nephilim are mentioned there. They're a powerful race of warriors. They are part of the mighty men of old. They would have been, tribal warriors. And when the Nephilim came, everyone was afraid. I mean, it's just, one of those stories that when people in a village would have heard the Nephilim are coming, everyone was terrified and they thought they were all going to die. And it was probably true that they were so cruel, they were so violent, they were so strong, no one could stand against them. But then, of course, came the universal flood. Noah and his family are saved, everyone else is destroyed. That means that the Nephilim died, and so did their memory. However, we come now to this story in Numbers 14. And the spies come back and say, look, we saw the Anakites there, and the descendants of Anak are in fact the descendants of Nephilim. So the story must have gotten out. Some of the Nephilim must have been able to survive the flood. Now, it wasn't true. But the spies go in and say, hey, these are the same stories. I mean, these are the Nephilim that are actually there. Now, you've got to ask yourself, how's that even possible? I mean, all of them died in the flood, and beyond that, how powerful could they actually be? Because as we know that, to a large degree, the Egyptian army would often come into Canaan and they controlled that land. I mean, the Nephilim weren't more powerful than the Egyptians, I can tell you that. And God had already devastated the Egyptians with a series of, 10 plagues. And then he had also destroyed the Egyptian military at the Red Sea. So they had seen all of that happen, and they recognized their God was stronger than the most powerful nation on earth. So whoever the Anakites were, they couldn't have been the Nephilim. They couldn't have been all of these people. But people weren't listening to that. Just hearing the words, the Nephilim are back, and they're over there, and we're going to be slaughtered. If we even dare go into their land, not one of us will survive. Those stories of the ancient world before the flood and how people were terrorized by this group of people, that's going to happen to us. And then the word filtrated out through the camp of Israel. And now people were beginning to, Numbers 14 verse 1 says, then all the congregation, that is all the 2 million of them, raised a loud cry, and the people wept all night. I think that was probably a gracious way of putting it. I think people were shrieking in fear all night. I think nobody was sleeping. I think people were openly complaining and saying, you brought us here to die. They're blaming God. They're blaming Moses. They're saying, we've got no chance. We're sitting ducks. So listen to Numbers 14, verse 3. It says, why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives, our little ones will become prey. Would it not have been better for us to go back to Egypt? See, just like in the case of King Saul, he's defeated an army, and now he's afraid of his own men. This moment when God brings, Israel to the promised land, and he says, I'm giving you all of this land, it's yours. It becomes this pivotal moment where people are overwhelmed by fear, and the fear of the moment causes them to act irrational and to imagine the worst possible scenarios, and now those worst possible scenarios in their minds become facts. They're not facts, they're just their fears that are praying with them. And fear is like that. When it takes hold, it paralyzes individuals. It can paralyze an entire nation. It blinds people's eyes. It kills their faith. It robs them of their joy. It keeps them from the things that matter the most. Now, there are numerous places in the Bible where we are told, don't fear, do not fear. Those words come up over and over again. When Jacob died, Joseph's brothers, who had betrayed their brother Joseph, they'd sold him into slavery, and now that their father was dead, the brothers are talking between themselves, and they say, you know what? I wonder whether Joseph has only forgiven us in order to appease our dad, and he's just, kind of kept his powder dry. You know what I mean? Waiting for dad to die, and once dad is dead, I'm going to smoke my brothers. I'll bet that's what Joseph has been thinking the whole time. Now, Joseph's never said that. All that Joseph has said is, I forgive you entirely. Instead, taking his word at face value, they begin to fear. They begin to imagine a scenario where Joseph comes to them. And so in response, they come to Joseph, they fall at his feet. They say, we're your slaves now. Please don't kill us, they say. And I love Joseph's response. He says, do not fear. Do not fear. He says, am I in the place of God? In other words, look, there is a judgment. I'm not your judge. God will judge you in the end of the day. Maybe you should fear God and stop fearing me. See, that's the issue. Same thing, Joshua chapter 10. The Amorites who, are living in the promised land. Joshua is, he's having this victory after victory in the promised land. So the Amorites, they gather together and they're going to make a counterattack. And here we read in Joshua, God says to him, do not fear them. Do not fear. I've given them into your hand. Or look at Matthew 10, verse 28. Jesus says, do not fear those who kill the body but can't kill the soul. Revelation chapter 2, verse 10, Jesus tells the church in Smyrna, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Over and over again we hear in the Bible, do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. And God just simply repeats it. Look, it's essential to your faith. You want to have to think about how many times fear dominates people's lives. People are afraid of cancer. I had an uncle, who never went to the doctor. He was a heavy smoker, never went to the doctor. He was afraid of a cancer diagnosis. In the end, he didn't die of cancer, he died of a heart attack because he never went to his doctor. There are people who are afraid if they give generously, what's going to happen to my finances. There are people who don't have faith when it comes to doing what God wants them to do because they imagine all of the outcomes. I've known people who don't go into ministry because they hear, it's hard, bad things are going to happen to me. They fear, they fear, they fear. They don't do what they think God wants them to do because they're overwhelmed by fear. Now, sometimes our fears are realistic. I get that. Some things that we fear are real dangers, and we're going to have to do things to mitigate those dangers. So I'm not arguing that we just, blunder forward without without even imagining what consequences there might be. Of course, we should look at, what are potential consequences to any action. I'm not arguing against that. I'm simply saying that there are people whose fears dominate them. They constantly think of the unrealistic things that could happen. Think about the things that you might fear. Fear of people is a snare. People fear slander from others. People fear the bully. People fear, this is what government might do to us. People fear if I speak politically incorrect language, what can be done to me? So, I'm going to make sure that I don't say anything because, who knows what could happen. I've known pastors who are so afraid of power plays that will happen in their church. They just end up doing nothing because they are fearing what potential might happen. Let me tell you of one of my own fears. When I was a young pastor, when I was first starting out in the ministry, and I kind of always was afraid every time Sunday rolled around at my sermon. I've had more than one dream as a young man. I used to dream that I was behind the pulpit preaching, and then I'd look down and realize I didn't have my pants on. It was a recurring dream. So if you're a psychologist out there, you could write me a letter and tell me what's wrong with me. Well, all that to be say, fears paralyze us and they prevent us from trusting God. I'm saying all these things because this is an application to the doctrine of providence. If you understand what I've been saying about providence, the Bible makes it very clear that God controls all things. He controls nature. In fact, He holds nature together moment by moment by His powerful will. He sustains all things. He sustains, or He controls who's going to govern this world. He controls kings. He controls prime ministers and presidents. He controls armies that march. He controls the lives of every single human being, as well as controlling the events in which we live. So we have two options before us. Shall we believe that God is in control, or shall we be constantly motivated by all of our fears? What shall we look towards? All of the fears that we have, or the fact that God is in control? You see, fear is the opposite of the doctrine of providence. So, let me now get as specific about this as I possibly can. We're living in a day today where a lot of people are fearing, because it seems to me that the world order that existed from the time of the end of the Second World War until the present has been rather stable. We've lived in this bubble of peace for a long time, and yet now it seems to many that bubble is beginning to burst and the world is becoming a more dangerous place than it was before. And so all sorts of people have, fears that begin to overwhelm them. They imagine conspiracy theories. They're really a result of the worst of our fears. They imagine a number of other things as well. So let me speak to one of these. Because wars happen in all sorts of parts of the world, it has spawned, as we know, over the last several decades, floods of refugees all over the world, and a great many of them seek to come into, the Western democracies, Europe or North America. And so that has led a great many people to wonder what's going to happen. Now, I do know that some of the reasons why people, resist the idea of people from, so many different countries coming, into our country is because they are, governed by a racist impulse. And I do know that's real. However, I don't think that's the majority of the fears that people have. Not everything is racist. Some people wonder, how many people can we take in and still maintain the kind of cultural values that we have? Are we going to lose, the history of our nation, and is going to become a very different nation? And, some people say, the neighborhood in which I live, I can't even understand half the people's language. I feel like I live in a foreign country. And so they fear that they're going to lose their culture. So all of these fears begin to overwhelm us, and we begin to think, well, so many shifts are happening. I don't know what's going to happen to our country. I don't know what's going to happen to my kids, my grandkids. I'm so afraid of what the future is all going to hold, all that kind of thing. So let me address this matter. So I'm not going to address it from a political matter. I'm not going to talk about how many refugees we should be taking in and so forth, or how many immigrants should come into our country every single year. That's another matter, and I'll leave it for politicians to decide that. I'm speaking about this from the perspective of the meticulous sovereignty of God, his providence over all things, and I'm speaking to the fears that people sometimes have. So where do I begin on this specific issue? Because I'm going to take the doctrine of the providence of God, I'm going to speak to one issue and apply it to one issue, and I've chosen this one. So let me speak to a number of things. First of all, I'm going to take us to Acts 17. And Acts 17 is this marvelous chapter in the Bible because it records Paul on his second missionary journey. He has come over from Asia Minor. He's crossed the Adriatic Sea. He's come into first what was called then Macedonia, which was northern Greece, and he's been traveling south, and he finally ends up in the city of Athens in Greece. It's a place filled with philosophers. He ends up in what's called the Areopagus, and he makes a remarkable statement to the people who are listening to him. He says, and I'm reading Acts 17, verse 26, "And he, that is God, made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place." So let's stop there. God has determined both the boundaries of nations as well as the periods of time, that is, the time periods in which they will live within these boundaries. So, that's from the Bible, first of all, where the whole idea of separate nations comes about. It's in the book of Genesis. It's after the flood. And after the flood, people begin to settle on a plain called the plain of Shinar. And there they build a city, the city of Babel. And there in Babel, they build a tower, and they say this tower will reach up into the heavens so that we're going to create a civilization that will reach to the gods, they say, and therefore we're going to control our own destiny, and we're going to become a super society, and this will be the centerpiece of all of the earth, and it will keep all of the earth as one unit of people. So that's the pride of that place. This will become the center of human civilization. Okay, so that was the motivation of building this city called Babel right after the flood. And then, of course, it flourishes for a time period, but then God comes and looks at this civilization and realizes how evil it is becoming. And so God separates the human race, he scatters them from there, and he creates various cultures and various dwelling places for human beings, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing because a super society of evil is prevented from developing. So, within God's sovereign purposes, within his meticulous sovereignty over this earth, within his providential care for the children of mankind, God allows various cultures to be in competition with each other, warfare even breaking out between them to prevent one super society from ruling all of mankind. So for instance, if one society becomes evil, there's still another place where people can flee to. Evil will not be, in its worst forms, evil will not be a global universal phenomenon. In God's providential care, that's what he's done. So Paul plays on that theme from the Bible when he's speaking in Athens. He says to the Athenians, look, this is what God has designed. And so he designs nation states and he determines their boundaries, but he also determines the length of time in which those nation states will be allowed to exist. He puts a boundary around it and finally it'll come to an end. So bring that into our world today. We live in a remarkable time. By God's providence, he has allowed Western liberal democracies to come into being, and those liberal democracies have given us bills of human rights, which has allowed us as Christians to live out our faith freely, to share our faith freely. We can say whatever we want to say freely, at least until recent times we've been able to do that. I know that laws have been introduced in Canada now to limit what we're allowed to say, so we're beginning to see these freedoms being slowly chipped away. Nonetheless, God has allowed this to exist in really an unusual fashion. We've been, to the most part, in the Western liberal democracies, Christians have been, to the most part, free from persecution. That's the thing that we've been blessed with. But now we look at Western liberal democracies, and they seem to be stretched. Things in their present form seem to be changing dramatically. We're standing at the precipice of change, and at the same time, the people who dwell here are changing. Now, from Acts 17, we say, yeah, but this is the hand of God who is doing that. Now, here Paul is not done. He says, not only does God determine the boundaries of nations, how long those nations will exist, when people live in them and when their population changes, God determines all of those events. But then he's not done. He says in Acts 17, verse 26, he says, God determines the allotted periods and boundaries of the human race, verse 27, so that, or in order that, people might seek God. In other words, God has a purpose in the way in which he allows nations to develop. He will maximize the amount of people who will seek God. Now look, I'm not a missiologist. A missiologist is someone who studies missions and the progress of the Christian gospel throughout the world. I have an interest in this matter, but I'm simply an amateur looking at this. But I don't have to be a missiologist to know that the very heart of the Christian world has moved from the Western world, something we used to call Christendom, to the global South. South America, Africa, places in Asia have become the heart of the Christian world. The heart of the Christian world is not in the West anymore. Now, if you didn't notice that, well, wake up, because it's changed. God, in his providential care, has moved the heart of the church to a different place in the world, and it's from there that the great next movement of the Christian faith will happen. So that's just a fact. Furthermore, let me also say that in the West, in the Western democracies, which once were, a pulsating heart of the Christian gospel where missions was going out, that's no longer happening. I mean, the most spiritually dangerous place that you can live in the world today, I would argue, it's places like North Korea, no doubt, but it's also in Europe, the only continent in the world where the church is actually in decline. It is a very dangerous spiritual place. But also, something else is happening. We also know that in these Western liberal democracies, the birth rate has been falling steadily, so that the average woman in a great many countries has, 1.2, 1.3 children. And so that's an unsustainable, demographers call that a demographic death spiral. So all of the fears that we have that says, the world's changing, it doesn't feel the same anymore. I mean, our culture is, changing dramatically, and that brings out fears, and I wonder what's going to happen. It's not that it's completely unrealistic. I recognize that the world is going through profound changes right now. But if I'm listening to what Paul said in Athens, and if I take it to heart, I recognize that God determines nations, their boundaries, and the time periods in which a culture will last. God determines that by his sovereign care so that, it says, men and women might seek and find God. God is arranging cultural developments for his glory, the good of his church, and the progress of the gospel. Now, if the first value in your life is not to sustain the culture which I presently have. Now, I know that some people, that's their first value. And I have nothing to say to you if that's you, because I think that anybody who has hope in Christ has a different value base. Greatest value that we would have is the progress of the gospel, the health of the Christian church. The name of Jesus is revered in every single place. I give up everything else in this life so that that could continue. That's the heart of a Christian speaking. See? Now, if that's what your heart is, you ought to look with what's happening today and say, God seems to be up to something. In his providence, God is moving in a given way. Fear not. Fear not. God is about to be glorified. The church is going to go forward. These are great days. They're not days where we look at and say, oh my, I'm afraid it's all going to fall apart. And the doctrine of providence teaches me that. So for people who are believers, understand this, that there are people from cultures all over the world that had no possibility of hearing the good news of Jesus before, who are coming into our nation and who are open to the gospel. And if the church can be shaken from her lethargy and can be recognize the hour that's before us and can grasp a hold of the providence of God and saying, our nation is rapidly changing and is never going to be the same again. And I believe that God is doing this so that more people can be reached for the gospel than ever before. Then if that's what you have come to realize, if you've grasped the providence of God, and you've grasped the glory of God, you'll say, these are wonderful days. I'm not afraid. I'm excited. I'm anticipating what is about to happen next because I know that Christ will be glorified. See, fear not. See, this is but one application to the doctrine of providence into the real lives of people. Instead of saying, oh no, we've got to work hard to make sure that we keep people out of the country. My response is to say, it's God who's bringing them into the country. And therefore, let's find out what God is doing. Clearly, within His sovereign care, something is happening. Well, I could speak about a lot of other places where we could apply the doctrine of sovereignty. I've spoken about only one issue, and that is fear. I can speak about other issues, that is the lack of love. I could speak another issue, and that is knowing how to trust God more. I mean, all of these areas, we apply the doctrine of providence to our lives and recognize the doctrine of providence, once it's embraced, changes how we look at every single aspect of our lives. It changes us from people who are constantly feeling like we're, a cork, bobbing around in the water, being swept away. Rather, we see ourselves now as people in the center of God's will and saying, this is my Father's world, recognizing that God controls all things and leading into it and saying, oh Lord, teach me what to do in this hour, for I know you're in control and I know you'll glorify yourself and I know you have a plan for me and I know you'll treat me well. See, grasp the doctrine of God's providence. You'll be forever changed. Thanks for being a part of Back to the Bible Canada today. May the Lord bless you. Thank you for watching today, and I want to ask you to make sure that you hit the like button and also subscribe to this channel so that you can receive any further notifications of all the videos that we prepare for you. Thank you so much for being a part of Back to the Bible Canada.